This intense presence was coming up behind me. This overwhelming, cosmic, wise, powerful. I grew up in a conservative Christian home, and I'm holding my little boy thinking, oh my goodness, that's God. That's God coming. And then the guilt began to bubble up again. I had the thought, I hope I can be forgiven.
I would love it if you would share your near-death experience story with us in whatever way you feel led, and then we'll move into some questions after that, if you're okay with it.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. And I'll be somewhat brief about the near-death experience. I'll give enough detail to give you some foundation, but I would love the conversation. I'm far more interested in the questions than the monologue on my end. And if anyone's interested, I mean, you can read the experience and the beforehand and aftermath in Knowing, which is available on Amazon, but I'll touch on that today. My near-death experience was a result of an automobile accident. The whole family was in the car, and it was myself, my wife, and our two young boys in the back seat. Now, the accident happened 20 years ago, in fact, over 20 years ago now. So I can speak of it. I couldn't even speak of these things for almost a decade. And I had no intention of ever writing a book about it or doing any of that. That all came about almost in a mystical way. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to write about it. I certainly didn't want to speak about it. But here we are 20 plus years after the fact, and I am. But on that fateful day of the accident, we were all driving in the car. I had the cruise control on 75 as fast as I could legally go, up the interstate. I was traveling through southern Utah, heading to the northern part of the state. And I lost control of the car. Now, there was reports of crosswinds, and there was reports of a pickup truck driving erratically. Maybe the most difficult part of the story is I believe I may have just dozed off at the wheel, just nodded off just for a second. But in doing so, I swerved to the right, I overcorrected to the left, and the car began to roll, not off the street, but down the street on the concrete at such a high speed. And it was a horrific automobile accident. The reports say the car may have rolled no less than 6 to 8 times. And I blacked out for most of that. But when the car came to a stop, I was completely conscious. And the first thing I heard was my 7-year-old son in the back seat crying. And it was that cry a father recognizes as, oh, he's okay. I've got to get to my son. I've got to get to my boy. But that's when I realized I couldn't move. I was pinned either to the floorboard or the seat. I couldn't tell. There was the rancid smell of gasoline, the broken glass everywhere. What had actually happened to me, both of my legs had been crushed. The left leg was eventually amputated above the knee. My back had been damaged. My rib cage had been damaged. My lungs were collapsing. My right arm had almost been torn off, and then the seatbelt had cut through and ruptured all my insides. I was physically an absolute mess. Emotionally, all I knew is my boy's crying, I've got to get to my son. But that's when I realized that no one else was crying. And that's when I knew that Tamara, my wife, was gone. And my youngest son, Griffin, who was only a toddler, he was killed as well. Both of them were killed instantly in the accident. And I was aware of that. I knew that in that moment. And yet I had, a hysterical 7-year-old. And I share these things not to be graphic, but to set the context. So there I am in the darkest moment of my life, the trauma, the panic, the guilt. I mean, I was driving the car. There aren't words for the guilt. Can I not get back those 3 seconds? What just happened, right? But it was in that darkness that suddenly light came. And this is the near-death experience, if you will, that there were many near-death or out-of-body experiences over the time frame of all that took place. But at the scene of the accident, light came. It came rushing to me. And it seemed to surround me. It felt like light was literally comforting me. It was comforting me in this horrible moment. And suddenly I could breathe. The pain was gone. It felt like I was rising above the accident, literally going above it. And I was literally wondering, how can I be okay? I was thinking, I can breathe. I don't hurt. How can I be okay? And in this light, Tamara, my wife, appeared. She was there with me. When I say appeared, like it felt so tangible, so physical. She was with me. And she was emphatic that I go back. You know, she kept saying, Jeff, you've got to go back. You've got to go back. You can't come. And we had this incredible conversation. I learned a lot about choice in this conversation, because here I was looking at the woman I loved more than life. And yet I knew I had a 7-year-old that was okay. I mean, he was crying, but I knew he was okay in the backseat of that car. And I made a choice. And yet I got to have this conversation with my wife, who had passed, but she was very much alive with me there. And I made this decision to come back. And in doing so, I found myself moving about a hospital, kind of wandering about a hospital. Now, I have no concept of time in this bubble of light, but what I later found out happened is that people arrived at the scene. You know, it was an absolute mess. A doctor actually stopped. He was able to see to Spencer and take care. Spencer is my oldest son, my 7-year-old, take care of the accident scene in a honoring and professional way. They had to extricate me from the car because of my physical injuries. I had to be life flighted or airlifted to the closest level 1 trauma center. I didn't know any of that. All I knew is I had crashed the car. I had said the most profound goodbye I'll ever say. And then I found myself moving about this hospital. Busy level 1 trauma center. I was encountering the doctors, the nurses, the patients, the families of the patients. I was able to see, and they didn't seem aware of me, but I could see everybody else. And yet I was seeing them in such a profound way. I knew them. I knew everything about them. I knew their love, their hate, their joy, their peace, their motivations. The word I use now is I was experiencing a oneness, an absolute connection, and it was infused with love. It didn't matter who they were or what they had done or what they hadn't done. I knew them and I loved them. And then I finally came upon a body or a man lying on the gurney that I didn't feel anything from, which I thought was weird given this profound situation and encounter. And I stepped closer to look, and that's when I realized, oh my gosh, that's me. But it was not me. I was having this profound connected experience, but that was my body. And it was an absolute wreck. And I knew I had to get back in it. And it was as easy as a thought. I didn't have to figure out, well, how do I get back in? It was like, no, I've got to go back in. And in the intention, boom, I was back in the body, but then back to the guilt, the grief, the physical injuries, the trauma, all of it. I mean, the regret, the weight. It was a very difficult thing. And I was ventilated. They had a big tube down my throat doing the breathing from my lungs. My right arm was immobile, having almost been torn off. My legs were obviously immobile, and they would soon after that amputate the left leg above the knee. They eventually tied down my left hand because I kept grabbing at all the equipment. And yet there I was now stuck back in the body, but committed to do my best to live for my surviving son. And I spent 5 months in the hospital. There was 18 surgeries in total, putting me back together. I was in ICU for an extended time. I would then go into surgical recovery, and then the infections, or I threw pulmonary embolisms, which are blood clots. Pulmonary emboli, I think, is I think that's the word they use, the medical term. But anyway, then back to ICU. It was a horrible, horrible hospital experience. But this out-of-body experience was profound, and I had others. But I don't, maybe you might have questions about that, Melissa. I don't know. I mean, we can talk about that, or I can continue on. You tell me what's most interesting for you, and we'll keep going, or we'll open it up.
Well, first, I want to thank you for sharing that. As you said, you never intended to talk about it, let alone write a book about it. And I'm sure that it's not any easier to talk about it today. So thank you for sharing that with us. You had an experience in the hospital where you had a very vivid dream that I believe you said was more than a dream. Would you like to share that? Because that was really profound for me when I read that.
I will. And that's what's interesting. This experience was at the end of my hospital stay. And I think that's relevant to share. So the two most profound experiences were at the scene of the accident, before I was administered narcotics. I mean, I was on morphine in the hospital and everything else. And people could say, well, that was a hallucination, or that was caused by the drugs. What I experienced at the scene of the accident was before drugs were administered. And then after getting out of ICU and, getting through surgical recovery, even with the back and forth. And finally, actually, this profound experience was at the end of my hospital stay. I was in the rehabilitation wing, and I was off of all the narcotics. They had done a colostomy situation, and they had, stabilized my abdominal injuries. They had worked on the shoulder. They had done the amputation. They had rebuilt the right leg. And I was only taking some Tylenol. There was not, and yet here's what happened. I finally was able to sleep. And when I say that, I mean, I naturally sleep on my side. I had been laying on my back so long, I had rubbed all the hair off the back of my head. The back of my head was bald. But I was finally able to sleep on my side, and I remember falling into a deep sleep. And even being conscious of, wow, I'm sleeping. I'm peacefully sleeping. But as I did, that same light, that light I felt at the scene of the accident that came in, it came again. The light came and surrounded me, and I felt like I was rising above the hospital bed. And as I did, I felt so joy. The pain was gone again. The grief was gone again. I mean, I had struggled so vividly with all of that. And yet this time, the light surrounded me. It lifted me up, and then it seemed to dissipate. It seemed to just disappear, and I was in the most incredibly beautiful place. I mean, I was in the most beautiful place, and people say heaven or the spirit world or the other side. I mean, the only word I can use that comes close is I was home. I mean, I was home. I felt so welcome, so familiar, so comforted, and I actually began to run. I wasn't running. I don't run in this realm with one leg and one that barely works, but in that realm I was running. And it was such a physical experience. I could feel the energy of the ground under my feet and intelligence, like in every cell, charging through my calves and thighs. And I was gleefully running, thinking, I'm home. And the pain was gone. And as I had that thought, I realized, I'm not here to stay. I knew it was a visit. And at that same time, there was this corridor off to my left. And so I knew intuitively, I'm to go this way. I'm to go this way. And I began to make my way down this corridor. And as I did, I realized there was a crib at the end of the corridor. And Griffin, my little son, who was only 14 months old at the time of the accident, my youngest son, he had been sleeping in a crib at that time of his life. And I raced to the crib, and there was my little boy. He was sleeping peacefully in that crib. And I looked at him and I just thought, that's my son. And I swooped him up. And I can't emphasize how physical it felt. I don't know if you've ever picked up a sleeping child. Have you ever picked, the weight of them, the heat of them, and I picked up my little boy and I held him again. He was solid against me. And I thought, it's him. In fact, I leaned over and I smelled his hair, just the smell of him. I don't know if you've got children, but.
Yes, I have 3. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, it was my boy. And it was so real. Everything. I could feel his breath on my neck. And as I held him, I began to weep, just thinking, I really get to hold him. Even if I'm just visiting, I really get to say goodbye to him. And as I was holding him, this intense presence was coming up behind me. This overwhelming, cosmic, wise, powerful. I grew up in a conservative Christian home. And I'm holding my little boy thinking, oh my goodness, that's God. That's God coming. And then the guilt began to bubble up again. I thought, my little boy's here because I lost control of the car. His life was cut so short because I crashed and he died. And I began to weep and the guilt, and this presence was coming closer and closer. And as I held my son and the presence came right behind me, I had the thought, I hope I can be forgiven. I was fearful, very fearful. And as soon as I had the thought, I hope I can be forgiven. And this almost felt physical. It's like those divine arms just wrapped around and held me and held him, just wrapped around us. And then that's when the download came. Just this huge outpouring. It's like the lid came off and just truth and knowledge and wisdom and light and love. And the first thing that was communicated is there's nothing to forgive. There's nothing to forgive. Everything's in perfect divine order. And I thought, how can that be? And then I suppose it's what they call the life review. My life was presented before my eyes, or I don't know that it flashed before my eyes, but I began to see my life. I saw my childhood, my parents' divorce, the insecurities that, caused in me, the role my brothers played, the accident. There was things I was saying, oh, no, that was a mistake. That was a mistake. But in these loving divine arms, I was told there are no mistakes. Your life is perfect. And I would say, well, that was wrong. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway. And this beautiful being communicated, those are your judgments of it, not ours. We love you. And it was so profound to be holding my son. And what was communicated was, you're as precious and perfect and divine to us as the child you hold. We love you. It was this overwhelming, unconditional outpouring of love. And it was very personal to me. But I knew if that was true of me, that was true of all of us, every one of us. And I saw things so much differently. It's as if I was seeing things as God sees them. And yet it was much different than I thought he would see them, or she would see them, or they would see them. It felt like the entire universe had gathered in support of me and my life and this love for my son. And yet that love was magnified out. And then I was also tutored about choice. I was told there's always free will and choice. And it was communicated, you could be mad at God your whole life, because your family was taken and the car crashed and that was allowed to happen. I was also told I could beat myself up the rest of my life in guilt. because I was driving the car. But I was given a new choice. I was told that I could exercise my will. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. My upbringing said it's your will be done. And yet this being communicated, your will is my will. That's how much we love you. What do you want to do? Perhaps you can give your son. You can exercise your freedom and give him. So it doesn't feel like he was taken away. And therefore you exercise your agency, your free will, and participate in this cosmic event that is all in divine order that you created. And that threw me for a loop, that I created. See, I believed that life was a test and God laid everything out. And I was, he was seeing how I reacted, and it was communicated, no, you created your life and we love you enough to support it. And all the players in that are supporting your experience for the expansion of your soul. Everything was love. Everything was light. And in all that love and light and beauty and peace, I was able to kiss my little boy and give him back. Literally let go and hand him over. And then I came to myself, or woke up, or suddenly was back in the body, in the hospital bed, back to the injuries, the amputation, all that went with it, but with a little different perspective. However, I grieved as miserably as a man grieves. It isn't like the accident happened and I had these profound experiences and I was okay. That the accident happened, I did have beautiful out-of-body or mystical or spiritual experiences. But then I grieved for years. I mean, you don't get over it. You might get used to it. I'll never get over it. I've become used to it, and I now see the wisdom or the blessing or what I've learned that I would have learned in no other way. But that was the most profound experience, which wasn't at the scene of the accident. It was after that. And I don't know that the doors ever really fully closed. I mean, beautiful things have happened. It's now been over 20 years. I mean, I can talk about this. I eventually fell in love again. I remarried. We adopted 2 boys, and I don't even call them my adopted boys. They just came to us in a different way. And, there's so many things that we could discuss, and let's do that. You don't want to listen to me talk. I would love to hear your insights, and we can have a conversation.
Well, thank you again for sharing that. There's so many things we could talk about here. First, I remember listening in one of your interviews because, like I said, I found your story at a key point in my life, and I actually memorized some of the things you said because they affected me so deeply. And I remember you saying that when you were holding your son and the presence had come up behind you, that it was like your son was part of you and you were part of God, and you were all part of everything that is. And you were experiencing I am that I am. Mm-hmm. And for me, because I was also raised in a very strict Christian home, and I am that I am was one of the good things that came out of that for me, because to me that spoke of something that I remembered, something that was too good for, like, almost too good to be true, because I could vaguely remember it. So I'd like to ask you, what is that experience like? What does I am that I am mean to you?
Oh, wow. It's so beautiful that you brought that up. I grew up reading the Bible, and Moses encountered a burning bush, and he said, "Who's that?" And it said, "I am that I am." To put it in a very personal context, I was so frightened that here's God, behind me, and he's holding me. And when those arms came around me, and you quoted that so well, it felt as if we all became one. In fact, it felt like I became God. And that was so difficult for me to say. And for years, but I became that. And I even asked that question, like, who am I? And that's when the phrase came, I am that I am. And I realized, oh, I am that I am. I'm part of that, and that is part of me. And as I said, it's a personal experience, but in that flash of enlightenment, if you will, I thought, wow, Not only is my little boy a beautiful manifestation of all that love, I'm a beautiful manifestation of all that love. And therefore, all of us, each and every one of us in our own unique way, is a perfect, profound manifestation of that love, of that light, of that divinity that I am, that I am. And I grew up with Jesus, and I still love Jesus. I love what he taught, but I saw it differently. Suddenly it wasn't about, dad's favorite who came to show us how good he was. Suddenly I realized, wow, that was what Jesus was teaching. Walk on the water, Peter. Why do you doubt? He was holding up a mirror saying, can you not see your own divinity? Can you not see that I am, and so are you? I mean, there's that profound passage where the apostles are with Jesus and they say, well, show us the Father and then we'll know what you're talking about. And this shifted for me because I used to think of this differently. And he said, if you've seen me, you've seen that. And there's all kinds of theologies around that. Oh, well, he was the Father. He was God in manifest. But I think what he was saying is, don't you realize we're all manifestations of that? If you've seen me, you've seen that, because if you go look in the mirror, you'll see that divinity. We are a manifestation of the divine. So gosh, love each other, take care of each other. And that's what he went on to say. This is the commandment, love each other. That's how people know. And so I'm like, oh, wow, that's different than I used to think about it. But it opened up a whole new reality to how much love there is and how much a part of it we are individually.
That was so beautifully said. And I'm really glad you took it that direction, because a large percentage of my viewers are from the deconstructing Christian world. And so one of their number one questions that they like me to ask is, what are your thoughts on Jesus? And so I really loved what you said there. Do you think there was any significance to why he came and why he died on the cross? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is a significant soul. This is a master. This is and I sometimes even get emotional. He's a dear friend of mine that walked this earth 2,000 years ago, but still whispers and shows me and points out. My thoughts on Jesus. What a profound, beautiful soul who came to show us the way. And the dying, the being lifted up to be seen. Here's how it has played out for me. His life was a beautiful example and a perfect example of empathy. When I say empathy, that's not sympathy. He's the one I can go to, and he knows exactly how I feel. He knows how Jeff felt when Griffin died. It becomes very personal. It becomes the suffering, the bleeding in the garden at every pore, the dying on the cross. For me, it's far more about empathy than about a God that demanded justice, or a human sacrifice. It's like, I understand there may be levels of that I'll never comprehend. But what I do comprehend is because of his suffering, because of his experience of the breadth and depth of the human experience, he knows how I feel. He knows how you feel. He can walk with me and may be the only person in the universe that can say, I know exactly how you feel because I suffered all those things. And so he's a dear friend, he's a master, and he's my biggest advocate, if you will, to say, look, embrace your own divinity, realize that we're divine, that I came not only to show you how magnificent I am, but to show you how magnificent you are, and to pave a way that you might know, that you might embrace the divinity within yourself and within everyone else. This is a very long answer because I'm passionate about this.
Oh no, go ahead. I'm loving it.
Well, I had an experience, and this was interesting. I mean, this was after the accident. This was years after I had remarried. We'd adopted the boys. In fact, they were teenagers at this time. And Spirit whispered to me this summer, during the summer, it was summertime, study just the Gospels. Just read what Jesus taught, read his parables. And I found in these parables beautiful, enlightened things about equality, about unconditional love. The two debtors, one owed 50, one owed 500. At the end of the day, when they could pay nothing, they were both freely forgiven. And it goes on and on and on, whether it's the prodigal son or the women looking for her pieces of silver that are lost. I mean, I was reading just the parables, but I had a vision. I had a vision that summer. And it was the Sermon on the Mount, it was as if I was there sitting at the feet of the master, learning and listening. And yet it was different. He said some things that didn't show up in my King James or my New World version of the Bible, For instance, he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," which is what my Bible said. But he added in this vision, he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God in everything."
Oh,
and
wow.
in every one. And I'm sitting there in this, it was a very lucid, crazy, I wasn't on drugs. In fact, what had happened is I'd tried to take my boys hiking, and with one leg and one bad one, and I have the walking stick and I couldn't keep up. And I said, "Boys, you go ahead. I'll wait here." And I sat on a rock lamenting over how come I can't walk? Why is it that I have this injury? Why is it I can't hike with my boys now that they're, reaching their adolescence, feeling picked on, right? Woe is me. And that's when this thing unfolded before my eyes. It's like I was sitting on that rock in the mountains, and suddenly there was the sermon in front of me. I was seeing it with spiritual eyes that felt like physical eyes. But blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God in everything and in every one, even in my amputation. So I was sitting here thinking that, I can see God in that. Consider the lilies of the field, because I walked slowly, and it was springtime or summertime, and the wild flowers were in the mountain. And that was the other thing. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They don't spin and toil, they just honor each other and look up at the light. And I was getting my own personal sermon, if you will. The most important thing, and maybe the profound thing, was that last statement in that sermon: "Be ye therefore perfect," which that had messed with me my whole life, right? And yet, as he said it, "Be ye perfect," suddenly I realized it was be. There was nothing to become.
Oh.
Embrace the perfection that you are. Consider the birds, how they fly, all these analogies. So I'm rambling at this point, but it was so profound for me to think, wow, I do love Jesus, but suddenly I had a deeper view into maybe what he was saying, which was different than I thought, and it was profound.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I've also been on a journey over the past couple of years to find out who Jesus really was and what he really taught. And it's led me to the same conclusions. And blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God in everything and everyone. It's just like that. That's it. That's everything. Because when you connect with the divine within you in your own heart, that's when you see the divine in everything else. At least that's the way it's worked for me.
I have experienced the same. Now, I learned it a little bit the hard way, but now I look at what he was saying, whether it was the adulteress, I don't condemn you, go your way, and forgive yourself. I mean, that might not say that in the Bible, but it's like seeing the divinity within you, within myself. And, when blessed are the pure in heart, once I see that in me, that's inspiring to be better and do better and be kinder and be more compassionate and have more empathy. And then that ripples out to everyone else. And suddenly I see it in them. It's like, wow, this homeless man on the street that probably is the end, everything that we think is not successful, he reeks of alcohol, he's shabby, he's unkept. But boy, do I see God in him, because he is divine. He is that I am, just the same way I am that I am. He's just on a different journey, and his path might be far more profound and divine than is mine. So judge not that you be not judged, right? I mean, there's just suddenly there's a new layer of truth for me in all that Jesus taught. And I feel he walks with me and teaches me, and sometimes smacks me upside the head like a big brother and says, be more loving. Let go of all those judgments and comparisons. And by all means, love yourself a little more. Give yourself a break,
Bringing it back to your story, when you went home from the hospital, there was a moment where I believe you were sitting in your driveway or in front of your house, and Spencer came out to meet you, and he sat on your lap in the wheelchair where you were sitting. And you said, in that moment, the veil fell away and you realized heaven is right here. And you said that you had the profound experience that you were holding your son in this realm just as you held your younger son in the other realm, and you realized there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, heaven is right here. So would you like to talk about that?
Oh, yes. I might cry when I talk about that. My 7-year-old son, who's now a grown man, it's like I say, it's been over 20 years. He's a grown man. He's married. But yeah, when I was brought home, and I wasn't able to go to my own house. I had to go to my younger brother's house, and I continued to have home health for months, and nurses and doctors would come in. They'd put a hospital in. I was in a wheelchair. My left leg was lopped off above the knee. My right leg was in a brace sticking straight out in front of me. My right arm with the shoulder repair was all in a sling. All I could do was drive an electric wheelchair with my one good left hand. And my brothers, bless them. I mean, my brothers were heroes. They almost lost their jobs to sit at the hospital with me. And they would have to pick me up. They would literally have to lift me and put me in the wheelchair. And Spencer had been staying with my younger brother, and they'd brought him in just like one of their own. And I was so worried about him. Like, how's he going to accept this? I'd been the rough and tumble dad, running, playing, my last memory with him before the accident was flying a kite, running. We were trying to fly a kite on our little family vacation. But here I was in a wheelchair with one leg and a colostomy bag to boot, hanging off my midsection. And I thought, how's he going to accept this? How's he ever going to accept me like this? How am I going to raise him? How am I going to do this on my own? How am I going to, all those questions, right? Well, as we arrived there at the house, and my brothers had built a ramp so I could get in, they were emphatic. You got to do this yourself. You've got to become independent. But they did have to lift me up and put me in the wheelchair. So I see Spencer looking out the window, watching as his uncles, my brothers are lifting me, his dad, out and literally have to lift me and put me in the wheelchair. And he came running out of the house and he came running toward me. And I thought, how is he going to accept this? This is so awful. I look so awful. I'm so sick. This is not right. And he ran toward me, and then he ran right past me. He ran right past me. And I thought, I knew this was going to be tough. I knew he'd have a hard time accepting me like this. I mean, he had seen me in the hospital, but now I'm on his turf, right? And I began to navigate the electric wheelchair to the ramp to turn it. And I just looked over my shoulder to see where Spencer had gone. And he'd actually run across the street, and he was knocking on all the neighbors' doors. And he was shouting, come out, my dad has made it home. Come see my dad, and I'm falling apart in the chair. And he did then run, and he threw himself on my lap, which just about killed me because I still had all the sutures, from the the midsection repair and all, and he threw his arms around me, and I did my best to explain. He was a Star Wars nut. He still is a Star Wars nut, but I said, look, I'm going to be like this for a while. They're going to get me a cool Darth Vader leg, and they're going to teach me how to walk, and I'm going to work really hard to get well, but I'm going to be in this wheelchair for a while, and we're going to deal with all this. Can you handle it? Are you going to be okay with this while I work on getting better? And this is the part you alluded to, but he threw his arms around my neck, and he said, Dad, if you were nothing but a puddle of blood, I would still love you. And, he's 7, right? And I began to weep, and I threw my arms around him. And that's when that veil, as you say, lifted. And I had been in the arms of God in those other realms, holding my youngest child who had passed. And suddenly that was no more divine than being in a wheelchair in this realm, holding my living son who had survived. And that's when I realized heaven is right here. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to become. There's simply to be in this moment and to embrace this unconditional love of a child, which felt as powerful as the unconditional love of God in many ways. And he was my hero to get me through it. He was my motivation. He's the whole reason I came back. And he was the motivation every day to keep working at getting well. And that was a beautiful part of the story, yeah.
What would you say to people who are dealing with either grief or guilt or both? And sure, there's probably no easy answer, but how do you work through those things?
You keep breathing, one breath at a time. You keep breathing. There's no easy way around it. You just got to go through it. But I can make them a promise. They are loved. Much of their judgments are their own judgments. And everything is light. You will get through it. It will get better. The day will come when you look back and say, oh, that's what I learned. And that's the question I ask myself. What am I learning? What am I learning? I have a youngest son, and I don't think he would mind me sharing this. He went through a horrible summer, got involved with drugs, ended up in jail, went to rehab, went to sober living. He's now clean and in recovery, and he's got a job and a girlfriend, and he's doing great, but he struggles with guilt. And yet I remind him, son, you are the man you are today because of what you experienced, not in spite of it. You have more depth and more empathy, and you've walked a path that, only you know. And therefore you'll have more compassion. You'll have more love. So don't beat yourself up. Realize that everything's in divine order, even the things that we judge as bad, sick, and wrong. And yet it's all for the expansion of your soul, out of love, out of mercy, and out of the glorious, plan of life, I suppose.
I remember you saying that it took you a period of about 10 years as you were working through and wrestling with all of these issues to be able to find the answers within yourself. Yeah. Would you like to talk about your own spiritual journey since the accident?
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, number one, the near-death experience kind of turned everything I thought I believed inside out and upside down, or at least expounded it in profound ways. My beliefs, which are just beliefs, my faith even, was absolutely transformed into trust. Into perfect trust. We're all in such good hands no matter what happens. And I dove deeper into even religion and my own religion, but also other different philosophies. And I studied strange things, or that me at the time were strange. I mean, Reiki, I became a Reiki master and what energy work, and I became aware of people's gifts. I let judgment and comparison go out the window, and I let go of the need to be right. I let go of the need to be right, and thought, I can become as a child. It's okay to not know. And yet I know what I know. And what I know is there's love. What I know is that we're divine. What I know is, wow, God held me and I became that. And therefore we're all part of that. And the spiritual journey, I'm probably far more spiritual than religious these days, whatever that means. They're just words. It's the meaning behind the words that become important. And the gift from it has become love. It's become compassion. It's become the willingness to, I don't know, to just put our arms around somebody and walk with them instead of judging it all or trying to make it right.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that you experienced oneness in your near-death experience. And a question that I get a lot is, do you think that we eventually will completely merge back with the divine and lose our individual identity? Or do you think that some way those two things exist simultaneously?
Well, I'll tell you what I experienced. I was merged into a oneness, but I was me. I was still me. I was still an individual. And I was honored by all that is. And I could honor back all that is. So my feeling is that there's oneness, and we're still in the oneness. We've just forgotten. We've just forgotten. So I embrace that, yes, I'll be me, but that I'm eternal, that you're eternal, that we really didn't begin and end, that we're connected to that divine, and we're having this iteration, we're having this incarnation, or whatever you want to call it. I'm experiencing what I am right now in this realm, but life is eternal. There's no beginning, there's no end, there's no death. Really, we just move on to what's next, and who knows what that looks like, But I like to feel, and my experience was I was me, and I'd always been me, but I'd always been eternal as well. And that was an interesting shift to try to grapple with too.
Yeah, because I think that the real us is our consciousness. It's that part of us that is aware. So that can't ever go away. It can be expanded, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put that. Yeah, it's expanded, but it's still me.
What do you think about hell? Do you think that there's a hell? And if so, what purpose do you think it has?
I think hell's right here. I don't think we're going to hell. I think we're choosing to be in it or not right now. Mm-hmm. I've been in hell here. I've experienced that, and a lot of it was my own creation. I was in the arms of a God that was so loving, that was so accepting, that was so forgiving. In fact, I was told there's nothing to forgive. It's all perfect. And so that doesn't necessarily equate to an entity that would put me in hell or would punish me or would, cut me off in a way that there was no connection, because what I experienced was that connection could not be denied. I could probably walk away from it. I probably could have run away and not been embraced by God, if you will. But the love was unconditional and eternal. And so I think the only hell we have is the hell we create right here, right now. And that might be, I probably sound like a heretic, but that's the way I feel about it.
Well, you're in good company. What do you think is the easiest way for us to connect with the divine here?
Oh, wow. And that's a great question. I mean, I've found a lot of time I'll think, how come I can't feel that love? How come I can't feel that again? How do I connect? How do I plug back into the oneness? Here's a little exercise that I found profound. And this is how subtle spirit or the divine works. I used to pray before the accident. I would have these eloquent prayers, asking and blessing and on and on and on. Now I just shut up and listen. I don't say so much. I be still. I be still. And here's the exercise I've found that works every time. If I make the prayers not about me, but if I just get in a quiet place and listen with perhaps a question of what can I do for someone else today? What can I do to make someone else's life better? And I, almost immediately, a little image will come up. I'll have an idea. I'll have a thought. I'll have an inspiration. And then do it. It might be as simple as I've got to text my mom today. Haven't talked to mom in a week or whatever, or 2 weeks. But just being open to what can I do for someone else? Then it seems like the inspiration flows and I'll have that little idea. It might be a simple thing, but if I do it, I feel connected. Then I have that joy. Then I feel that love. And that's what I do these days to try to stay plugged in, right?
That makes so much sense, and it's so simple. Thank you so much for sharing that. I see that I could literally talk to you for so much longer, but I see we're coming to an hour here. So I want to thank you again so much for making yourself available to answer our questions and share your story. Would you like to tell people how they can learn more about you?
Oh, gosh, if they care to learn about me, I would say go do something for someone else. But you can find me on social media. There is a website. It's called Envoy Publishing. Envoy is ENVOY, publishing.com. And there's videos, and you can certainly find my book there. My book is Knowing. It's available on Amazon. You can get it in all formats. You can also email me. It's just my full name, Jeffrey, Jefffery. I spell a little different. C, that's my middle initial, Olsen, which is OLSEN.com. But yeah, if I can serve anyone or support anyone, feel free to reach out. And that's what it's about, folks. We're here to walk with each other and love each other. And if we're not doing that, then we can shift it and do it a little better.
Thank you for watching the Love Covered Life podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and comment with your thoughts and opinions, and check the description box for the links to my free community where I share lots of resources, my Pay What You Can community where we do classes and challenges together, my TikTok, Instagram, my Clips channel, and lovecoveredlife.com where I share my paintings. Thank you so much for your support.